The wind howled across the open plains, bending the tall grass like waves in a raging sea. Dark storm clouds rolled in overhead, heavy with rain and thunder. A lone Mustang mare, her golden coat slick with sweat, stood over her newborn foal. She nudged it desperately, her muzzle pressing against its tiny body, but the foal didn't move. Not even a twitch. Skye had waited months for this moment, carrying her foal, protecting it from the dangers of the wild, surviving brutal winters and scorching summers. But now, as she stood alone on the vast open land, the truth struck her with the force of the storm. Something was wrong. The foal had entered this world weak, struggling to breathe. The birth had been difficult, draining Skye of her energy. She had done everything she could, licking its damp coat, nickering softly, urging it to stand. But the foal's legs remained limp, its body too frail to rise. Lightning cracked through the sky, illuminating the mare's panicked eyes. The storm was closing in. Time was running out. Skye whinnied, her cry piercing the wind. She nudged her baby again, this time more forcefully, willing it to move. But the foal only let out a weak breath before falling still once more. The herd was gone, long gone. Hours ago, the lead stallion had called them forward, sensing the storm's approach. They had waited for Skye, but when she refused to leave her struggling baby, the stallion made his decision. They moved on without her. Now, she was truly alone. A mother. A foal. A storm that showed no mercy. The first drops of rain fell, cold and sharp against her coat. Skye lowered her head, shielding her baby as best she could, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The foal needed warmth, shelter, protection she couldn't provide here. Then, the sound came. A deep, guttural howl, carried by the wind. Skye's ears shot forward. The coyotes had been watching. Waiting. Another flash of lightning revealed their silhouettes in the distance, yellow eyes glinting, bodies low to the ground. They had smelled weakness. They knew she was vulnerable. Skye snorted fiercely, stomping her hoof, warning them to stay back. But she was exhausted, drained from giving birth, and the foal wasn't moving. For the first time, a terrible realization crept into Skye's heart. She might not be able to save her baby. And then, a second sound, not a howl, but something deeper, more human. The distant thunder of hooves. Someone was coming. Skye stood motionless, her body shielding her foal from the cold rain. Her ears twitched at the sound of approaching hooves, but she kept her gaze locked on the small, still figure beneath her. The foal wasn't moving. Her heart pounded as she nudged it again, one last time, praying for any sign of life. A breath. A twitch. Anything. Nothing. A sharp gust of wind whipped through the plains, sending a shiver down her spine. The storm had come in full force now, the sky flashing with violent streaks of lightning. Skye let out a low, distressed whinny, her call lost in the howling wind. She had failed. A mother's duty was to protect, to bring life into the world and keep it safe. She had fought with everything she had, but it wasn't enough. Skye's nostrils flared as she took in the scent of the damp earth. The coyotes were still there, watching, waiting. They wouldn't rush in just yet. Not while she stood guard. But they knew what she knew. The foal was gone. And they had patience. A crack of thunder rolled across the sky, rattling her bones. Her hooves shifted anxiously. She could still hear the sound of approaching hooves. Someone was out there, coming closer. But was it friend or foe? Then, movement. Skye's ears swiveled toward the edge of the field. A dark silhouette appeared through the curtain of rain, tall, steady, human. A man. She snorted aggressively, stomping a hoof. The last thing she needed was another threat. The figure stopped at a distance. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Then, slowly, he raised a hand, palm open. Sky snorted again, nostrils flaring. He was too close. But he didn't step forward, didn't try to chase her off. He was just standing there. A few paces behind him, his horse, a sturdy, chestnut-colored stallion, stood still, rain dripping from its coat. The man had ridden in alone. Sky didn't know what to make of it. She turned back to her foal, lowering her head one last time, hoping against hope for some impossible miracle. Still nothing. Her muscles tensed as she felt the finality of it settle in. She couldn't stay here forever. The herd was gone, the storm was getting worse, and the coyotes were getting closer. She should run. She should save herself. But she couldn't move. The moment she turned away, she knew she'd be leaving her baby behind for good. A fresh wave of grief rose in her chest, unlike anything she had ever known. She had survived mountain lions, brutal winters, stampedes, but nothing compared to this. A mother's love was supposed to be enough. Why hadn't it been enough? A pained, exhausted sigh left her lips. Slowly, Sky raised her head toward the sky, letting the rain wash over her. Then, movement. Not from the coyotes. Not from the man. From the foal. A faint, weak, struggling breath. Sky's heart leapt. She swung her head down, nuzzling her baby frantically. A tiny twitch. A flicker of movement in its fragile legs. Alive. Barely. The foal was still dangerously weak. The cold, the exhaustion, it could still take him at any moment. But he was trying. Sky whinnied urgently, licking his damp coat, encouraging him. She knew he had to stand. If he didn't, the cold would steal him away for good. But the foal didn't have the strength. And now, the coyotes knew. Low growls rippled through the air as they crept closer, yellow eyes locked onto the struggling newborn. The lead coyote, a scarred, scrappy male, took a careful step forward. Sky bared her teeth, stamping her hoof aggressively. She would fight if she had to. She would do anything to protect her baby. But she was weak too. The birth had taken its toll. And the coyotes could smell it. The scarred coyote took another step, his muscles tensing. The others followed his lead. Then, a deafening crack. Not thunder. A gunshot. Sky whirled around, eyes wild with fear. The man, he had fired into the air. The coyotes scattered instantly, their whines of alarm disappearing into the wind. Sky's chest heaved, her ears flicking wildly. The man didn't move toward her, didn't chase her off. He just stood there, lowering his rifle. And then, he turned away. Sky watched as he walked back to his horse, his movements slow and careful. He mounted the stallion and rode back toward the trees, disappearing into the misty rain as if he had never been there at all. He hadn't come to take anything. He had come to give them a chance. Sky turned back to her foal, her heart pounding. The storm still raged, but for the first time, there was hope. Now, she had to decide. Stay here and risk losing him again? Or find shelter before it was too late? Sky stood frozen, her body tense with exhaustion, relief, and fear all at once. The foal was alive, but barely. His tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. His legs trembled each time he tried to push himself up, only to collapse back into the mud. The storm had lessened, but the world around her was still a battlefield. The wind howled, the ground was slick, and the shadows of the trees held unseen dangers. But the greatest danger of all still lurked in the distance. The coyotes had not given up. They were patient. They knew the foal was still weak, still vulnerable. And now, they had learned something else, too. The strange two-legged creature, the man, had interfered. But he had also left. That meant Sky and her foal were on their own again. Sky nickered softly, lowering her head to gently nudge the foal's damp, frail body. He had to stand. If he stayed down too long, the cold would take him. She could feel it. A deep, instinctive terror clawed at her chest, the knowledge that time was running out. The foal let out a weak, desperate whimper, his tiny ears flicking as his mother's touch urged him forward. He tried again, his thin legs splayed out beneath him as he pushed against the mud. Sky held her breath. For a moment, it looked like he might do it. Might rise. Might survive. But then, his legs buckled, and he crumpled back down. Sky's ears flicked toward the tree line. The coyotes were still there. Watching. Their glowing yellow eyes pierced through the early morning mist. The scarred leader let out a low, guttural growl, as if testing her. Waiting for her to give up. Sky knew what the wild expected of her. She had seen it before. The strong survived. The weak were left behind. That was the law of the land, the unspoken rule every wild creature followed. Her herd had followed it when they left her behind. The coyotes followed it as they waited for their chance to strike. And now, the wild expected her to follow it, too. To leave her foal behind. To move on. The very idea made her ears flatten against her head. She would not. She could not. Sky let out a sharp snort, shaking off the cold, the exhaustion, the pain in her body. If the foal couldn't stand, she would help him. But she was running out of time. Her muscles ached as she bent down, gently gripping the foal's scruff with her teeth. It wasn't natural for a horse to do, Mustangs didn't carry their young. But Sky was desperate. She tried to lift him, tried to move him just enough to get him on his feet. But the foal was too heavy, too limp. Sky let out a frustrated grunt, stepping back. She couldn't do it alone. And she had no one left to help her. Or so she thought. A lone watcher. High on the ridge, hidden between the trees, Jack watched. The old rancher sat atop his chestnut stallion, binoculars in hand, eyes locked on the desperate mare below. He had seen a lot in his years on the land. Wild horses, wolves, and every battle for survival that played out in these harsh plains. But something about this one was different. He had been ready to leave, to let nature run its course, just like it always did. But something kept him rooted to the spot. The way the mare had stayed by her foal, even when the herd abandoned her. The way she had fought back against the coyotes, despite knowing she was outnumbered. And now, this. She was breaking the laws of the wild. The same laws Jack had spent a lifetime watching play out. A Mustang mother should have left that foal behind. But she hadn't. Jack lowered his binoculars, his jaw tightening. He knew that kind of love. Once upon a time, he had seen it in his wife's eyes, in the way she clung to their daughter when she was sick. When there was nothing they could do. A hollow ache settled deep in his chest, one he had spent years trying to bury. Jack sighed. He should turn back. He should let the Mustang mother do what she needed to do. But when he looked down at the foal, so small, so weak, so close to death, he knew. He couldn't walk away. Sky's choice. Sky lowered her head again, nudging the foal fiercely now. Wake up. Move. Please. She let out a desperate, trembling whinny, one that echoed through the plains. A cry for help. One that was heard. Because at that very moment, Jack tightened his grip on the reins and made a decision. He spurred his horse forward, cutting through the rain and mud, making his way toward the Mustang mother and her dying foal. This time, he would not leave. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, misty dawn. The land was drenched, the scent of wet earth thick in the air. Sky stood over her foal, nudging him desperately, urging him to stand. He tried. His thin legs trembled as he pushed against the mud, his ears flicking back with effort. But the moment he lifted his body, he collapsed again, too weak to hold himself up. Skye whinnied sharply, frustrated, desperate. The coyotes were still watching. Waiting. And so was the man. Jack pulled the reins slightly, guiding his stallion closer, his eyes locked on the struggling mother and her foal. His instincts told him to stay out of it. He'd lived by one rule his whole life: don't interfere with the wild. Nature had its way of sorting things out. Always had. But his gut was telling him something different. Jack watched as Skye lowered her head, nuzzling her foal fiercely, refusing to accept the truth. She wouldn't leave him. She would die before she left him. Jack swallowed hard. He knew what that kind of love felt like. Years ago, he had seen it in his wife's eyes, the night their little girl lay burning with fever. He had sat beside them both, holding his wife's hand, feeling her shake with silent, helpless sobs. She had begged God for a miracle that never came. Jack had never prayed again after that night. But looking at this wild Mustang mother, standing guard over her dying foal, something inside him stirred. Skye let out another shrill whinny, turning her head toward him now, really seeing him. A warning. A plea. He wasn't sure which. The scarred coyote let out a low growl, stepping closer again. Jack saw it shift its weight, preparing to lunge. Jack tightened his grip on the reins. No. Not today. With a swift movement, he reached for his rifle, fired a shot into the air. The explosion shattered the silence. The coyotes scattered, their yelps fading as they disappeared into the trees. Skye flinched but held her ground. Jack exhaled, lowering his rifle. But the problem wasn't over. The foal was still too weak. Jack watched as Skye nosed at him again, her muscles tense. She knew it too. If she couldn't get him to his feet soon, he wouldn't make it. Jack made his choice. With a slow, steady movement, he swung down from his horse. Skye snorted loudly, stepping in front of the foal, ears pinned back. She didn't understand what he was doing. Didn't trust him. Jack held up a hand, his voice low and steady. Easy, girl. Skye pawed the ground, her nostrils flaring. Jack knew one wrong move could send her charging. But he had been around wild horses long enough to know one thing. They didn't trust words. They trusted actions. So, Jack didn't move forward. Instead, he crouched, getting lower, making himself smaller. Less threatening. Skye watched him closely. Jack's eyes flicked to the foal. He wasn't just weak. He was freezing. The night air had soaked him to the bone, and Jack could already see the signs of cold shock. Jack exhaled slowly. This was a mistake. A stupid mistake. But he wasn't going to watch another life slip away. Not if he could help it. Slowly, carefully, he removed his jacket, folding it in his hands. He held it out just a little, never breaking eye contact with the mare. Skye's ears twitched. Then, he placed it on the ground. Between them. Jack took a slow step back. A test. Skye sniffed the jacket hesitantly, her nostrils flaring. She could smell him on it. But she didn't bolt. Jack took that as a sign to keep going. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a small blanket. If he could just get something warm around the foal, it might give him a fighting chance. He inched forward. Not toward Skye. Toward the foal. Skye's body tensed, but she didn't move to stop him. Jack carefully laid the blanket over the tiny, shivering body, making sure not to cover his face. The foal barely stirred. Jack clenched his jaw. He's cold, he murmured, more to himself than to the horse. Too cold. Skye lowered her head, nudging the foal again. He twitched, but it wasn't enough. Jack exhaled, staring down at the fragile life between them. "This ain't gonna be enough," he muttered. He could walk away now. Let nature take its course. But if he did, the foal wouldn't last another hour. And Sky would never leave him. She'd stay here. Until the end. Jack rubbed a hand down his face, sighing heavily. He was going to regret this. Then, he straightened up. "I can help him," he said, his voice low. Sky's ears flicked forward. Jack reached for his rope. Slowly. Deliberately. "If we get him out of the cold, get him warmed up," Jack sighed. "He's got a chance." Sky stared at him. Jack tightened his grip on the rope. "But I can't do it alone." Silence stretched between them. A moment of understanding. Sky shifted her weight, then, ever so slightly, she stepped aside. Jack exhaled. That was all the permission he needed. He crouched down, carefully lifting the foal's fragile body into his arms. Sky snorted anxiously, pacing beside him as he stood. Jack knew she could change her mind any second. She could turn and run. But when he took a step toward his horse, she followed. Jack shook his head. "Well, I'll be damned." He carefully swung into the saddle, keeping the foal wrapped tight in the blanket. Sky never took her eyes off him. Then, with a click of his tongue, Jack turned toward the ranch. And Sky followed. No force. No rope. No fight. Just a mother, following the man who had become her foal's only hope. Jack rode through the damp plains, his grip firm around the fragile bundle in his arms. The foal barely moved, his breathing slow and shallow. Too cold. Too weak. Sky followed close behind, her hooves splashing through the wet earth, her golden coat darkened by the rain. She had no rope on her neck, no halter, nothing binding her to him. And yet, she followed. Jack had seen plenty of wild horses in his time, but none like this one. A mother who refused to leave, even when everything told her to. She didn't trust him. Not completely. But she trusted him enough to stay close. And right now, that was enough. The foal let out a weak, trembling breath. Jack glanced down, his jaw tightening. He's fading. Jack spurred his horse forward, pushing toward the distant barn. The old wooden structure came into view through the mist, its doors swinging slightly in the wind. He needed to move faster. The first test. Jack swung down from the saddle the moment they reached the barn, cradling the foal as he moved inside. The warmth of the enclosed space hit him instantly, the scent of hay and horses thick in the air. Sky stopped at the entrance, her nostrils flaring. She didn't like this. The walls. The closed doors. She had spent her entire life in the open plains, free and wild. Jack could see the hesitation in her muscles, the way her ears flicked back and forth. She could bolt. Right now. Jack didn't say anything. He didn't force her in. Instead, he carefully set the foal down on a thick bed of straw, grabbing an old, heavy blanket from the corner. He wrapped it around the tiny body, rubbing his hands gently along the foal's sides. "Come on, little guy," he muttered under his breath. "Stay with me." The foal gave no reaction. Jack gritted his teeth. "Come on." Sky snorted sharply. Jack glanced up. She was still standing at the barn entrance, her body half turned away, her muscles tense as if ready to run. Jack's hands stilled. "This is the only shot he's got," he said, his voice low and calm. "But I ain't keepin' you here. You do what you gotta do." Sky didn't move. Jack turned his focus back to the foal, pulling off his own coat and placing it over the blanket for extra warmth. Nothing. His chest tightened. The foal was slipping. Jack let out a slow breath. He reached over and grabbed a clean rag from the nearby bucket, dipping it in warm water. If the foal wouldn't wake on his own, Jack would help him. But before he could touch him, a shadow moved. Sky. Jack froze as she stepped forward, slow and cautious, her ears flicking nervously. She was inside the barn now. Jack watched as she moved closer, her hooves careful on the straw. She lowered her head, her warm breath brushing against the foal's face. She nudged him once. Then again. Jack held his breath. Then, finally. A sound. A small, weak whimper. Jack exhaled in relief. Sky nuzzled her baby fiercely, licking his damp coat, urging him to keep fighting. Jack let her. A ghost from the past. Jack pulled back, watching the scene unfold before him. Something ached in his chest. Something he didn't like to acknowledge. The last time he had sat like this, kneeling beside someone he wanted to save. It had been his daughter. The memory hit him harder than he expected. Her tiny body burning with fever. His wife's soft sobs in the candlelight. The doctor's quiet, sorrowful shake of the head. Jack had felt this same helplessness before. And it had broken him. For years, he had lived with the belief that some things just weren't meant to be saved. That no amount of fight, no amount of love, could change fate. But looking at this mother, this wild creature who refused to leave her baby behind, Jack wasn't sure anymore. Maybe there were some fights still worth having. Maybe not every story had to end the same way. Jack cleared his throat, pushing the memories back down where they belonged. The foal wasn't safe yet. He reached for an old milk bottle, one he had kept stored in case an orphaned calf ever needed it. He filled it with warm goat's milk, then turned back to Sky. She lifted her head at his movement, her eyes sharp. Jack knew what she was thinking. She didn't trust him yet. And that was fine. He held out the bottle. An offer. Sky sniffed it cautiously. Her ears twitched back, uncertain. Jack kept his hand steady. The foal gave a tiny, weak cry. Sky hesitated for only a second more, then stepped aside. Jack brought the bottle to the foal's mouth, tilting it carefully. For a moment, the tiny thing didn't react. Then, a small, feeble suck. Jack smiled for the first time in years. Jack sat on the cold barn floor, his back against a wooden post, watching the foal fight for life. The bottle was half empty now, a small victory, but Jack knew better than to celebrate too soon. The foal was still dangerously weak. He wasn't out of the woods yet. Sky stood protectively over her baby, her golden coat glistening in the dim lantern light. She hadn't left his side. Not once. Even as Jack worked, feeding the foal in slow, careful sips, Sky had kept her eyes locked on him. Jack didn't blame her. She had risked everything to follow him here. Her trust was a fragile thing, and he wasn't about to break it. He set the bottle down, exhaling as he rubbed a hand across his face. Exhausted. It had been years since he had spent an entire night awake like this, since he had fought this hard for a life he wasn't even sure he could save. And yet, here he was. Jack adjusted the blanket over the foal's frail body. He was warm now. That was good. But he was still too weak. Sky nuzzled the foal's neck, her low, comforting whicker breaking the silence. Jack had seen plenty of mares with their young before, but never one so determined, so unwilling to accept fate. She wasn't just any horse. She was a mother. And Jack knew better than anyone what a mother's love could endure. The shadows return. Jack stood up stiffly, stretching out the ache in his back. He needed more supplies, a fresh bucket of warm water, another blanket, maybe some oats for Sky. But as he moved toward the barn doors, something stopped him. A sound. Low. Unsettling. A familiar growl. Jack's jaw tightened. Coyotes. He moved toward the door, pulling it open just an inch, enough to see into the misty dawn. The scarred leader stood just beyond the fence, its yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light. It hadn't given up. Neither had the others. For, maybe 5 sets of eyes peered from the darkness, their bodies tense, their hunger palpable. Jack's stomach twisted. They had followed him back. The barn doors had held them off for now, but for how long? Jack cursed under his breath. He had been so focused on saving the foal, he hadn't thought about what came next. He turned back to Skye. She stood tense, her ears flicking, her nostrils flaring. She knew. Jack reached for his rifle, his grip tightening around the worn wood. He didn't want trouble. But if the coyotes forced his hand, he wouldn't hesitate. A desperate standoff. Minutes stretched into an hour. The foal hadn't moved much, but he was still breathing. Jack knew he should be relieved. Instead, he was watching the fence. The coyotes were still there. Not moving. Not attacking. Just waiting. Skye had positioned herself between them and her foal, ears pinned, muscles tight. Jack saw the way she shifted her weight, the slight tremble in her legs. She was tired. So was Jack. And so was the foal. Jack clenched his jaw. He had spent years living alone, minding his own business. But now, he wasn't just himself anymore. He had 2 lives depending on him. And he wasn't about to let either of them down. Jack pulled in a deep breath. Time to end this. A final warning. Jack pushed open the barn doors, stepping out onto the damp earth, rifle slung over his shoulder. The coyotes' heads snapped toward him, ears perking up. Jack raised the gun, not to shoot, but to send a message. "I ain't in the mood for games," he muttered, cocking the rifle. The scarred leader bared its teeth. Jack fired into the air. The gunshot shattered the silence. The coyotes flinched, scattering back toward the tree line. Jack didn't lower the rifle until the last shadow disappeared into the mist. He exhaled slowly, turning back toward the barn. Skye was still standing guard over her foal, watching Jack carefully. He met her gaze. "We're safe," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it to her or himself. For now, at least. But Jack knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The barn was quiet except for the faint rustle of straw and the slow, steady breathing of the foal. Jack leaned against the wooden beams, rubbing his tired eyes. The battle wasn't over. The foal had survived the night. But would he survive the day? Jack could see it in the little thing's movements. He was still weak. Still struggling. Even after being warmed and fed, his legs couldn't quite hold his weight. Skye stood over him, ever watchful. Every time the foal tried to rise, she nuzzled him gently, encouraging him. Refusing to let him give up. Jack exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He couldn't do much more. He had kept the foal warm, fed him, driven off the coyotes. But now, it was up to the foal himself. He had to stand. Or he wouldn't make it. A mother's determination. Jack watched as Skye lowered her head, nudging her baby again. The foal whinnied softly, his tiny ears flicking at her touch. He tried. His thin legs trembled as he pushed himself up, hooves sliding against the straw. His body shook with effort, muscles barely supporting him. Jack held his breath. "Come on, kid." The foal wobbled, and collapsed again. Skye let out a deep, low whinny. Jack's chest tightened. She knew time was running out. Horses were meant to stand within hours of birth. If they couldn't, they didn't survive. And if the foal didn't stand soon. Jack didn't want to finish that thought. Skye licked the foal's damp coat, trying again. Encouraging him. Jack watched as the foal's little ears flicked, responding to his mother's presence. Then, he tried again. His muscles trembled as he pushed up on wobbly legs. Jack felt a flicker of hope. Sky nickered softly, stepping back just a little, giving him space. The foal swayed, his front legs locking awkwardly. His body shook violently from exhaustion. But he was standing. Jack exhaled. Finally. But the battle wasn't over yet. The foal had stood. Now he had to walk. The real test. Sky took a slow step forward, watching her baby carefully. Jack stayed still, not interfering. This was her moment. The foal gave a tiny, uncertain whimper. Sky let out a soft, reassuring nicker. Then, she took another step. The foal blinked, his shaky legs trying to follow. He lifted one hoof, then another. Jack's heart pounded. One step. Another. The foal stumbled but didn't fall. Sky nickered again, her ears twitching back in encouragement. Jack ran a hand over his face. Damn. The kid had fight in him. The final threat. Jack turned, stepping toward the barn doors. The morning light had fully broken through now, the storm nothing but a memory. But the dangers weren't over. Jack scanned the tree line, his grip tightening around his rifle. The coyotes had scattered last night. But for how long? His gut told him they weren't done yet. And he was right. Movement. The scarred leader stepped into view, watching from the shadows. Jack clenched his jaw. Not today. He swung the barn doors open wide, making sure the coyote saw him standing between them and what they wanted. The coyote's ears flattened. Jack took a step forward, boots crunching against the damp earth. You got your warning, he muttered. He cocked the rifle. The coyote hesitated, then slowly turned, slinking back into the trees. Jack didn't move until the last shadow disappeared. Only then did he exhale. They wouldn't be coming back. Not with him here. A new beginning. Jack turned back toward the barn, the tension in his body finally easing. Sky stood near the stall, watching him. But this time, her ears weren't pinned. They were forward. Curious. Jack met her gaze. For the first time, she didn't look like she was waiting to bolt back into the wild. She looked like she was considering something else entirely. Jack rubbed the back of his neck, shaking his head. Well, girl, he muttered, glancing at the foal. Looks like we might have a problem. Sky just blinked at him. Jack sighed. Yeah. They weren't leaving just yet. Jack leaned against the barn door, arms crossed, watching the foal wobble on his spindly legs. He had made it this far. But Jack wasn't sure what came next. Sky stood protectively nearby, watching her baby closely. Her ears flicked toward Jack every now and then, as if measuring whether he was still a threat or an ally. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He'd done his part. The foal had survived the night, had stood, had taken his first steps. It was up to them now. Sky could leave. The barn doors were wide open, the world waiting just beyond the fence. Jack had half expected her to bolt the moment the foal was strong enough. But she hadn't. Not yet. Jack wasn't sure what to make of that. Sky's instincts. The foal nuzzled against his mother, searching for milk. Sky lowered her head, licking his small, damp coat, nuzzling him in return. Jack watched quietly, giving them space. Sky's instincts were still sharp. She knew what to do. She had protected her foal against the wild, risked everything to keep him alive. But now, she was somewhere unnatural to her, inside a barn, surrounded by wooden walls and fences. Jack knew she didn't belong here. She knew it too. So why was she still here? Jack sighed, shaking his head. Maybe she just needed time. A moment of trust. Jack grabbed a bucket and filled it with fresh water from the well. He set it near Skye, stepping back to give her space. Skye sniffed the air cautiously. She took a hesitant step toward the bucket. Then another. Jack stayed completely still. This was her choice. Skye lowered her head, and drank. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She trusted him. At least, a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. A hard decision. Jack stepped outside, staring toward the open fields. The storm had passed, leaving the land fresh and green. The herd had moved on, disappearing into the endless horizon. Skye had a choice to make. She could take her foal and go. Back to the wild, back to her herd. That's what wild horses did. That's what they were supposed to do. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. But something didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way she kept glancing at him, as if still deciding whether she belonged here or not. Maybe it was the way she hadn't bolted, even with the barn doors wide open. Or maybe she wasn't sure either. Jack sighed. She wouldn't stay. Not forever. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't ready to leave just yet. The first steps toward something new. The foal let out a small, wobbly whinny, stretching his tiny legs as he explored the barn. Jack smirked. The little guy had spirit. Skye followed her baby, never letting him out of her sight. Jack leaned against the fence, arms crossed. "You're something else, girl," he muttered. Skye flicked an ear toward him but didn't turn away. Jack shook his head. What was he supposed to do now? The foal still needed time. He wasn't strong enough to survive in the wild yet. But Jack also knew Skye wasn't meant for fences. She was meant for the open land. Jack sighed again. Maybe she'd tell him when she was ready. For now, they were right where they needed to be. Jack stood at the edge of the pasture, arms crossed, staring at the open land beyond the fence. The morning sun had begun its slow rise, painting the sky in soft streaks of gold and orange. Behind him, the foal wobbled forward, his legs stronger now, his steps no longer as uncertain. Skye followed, her golden coat gleaming in the light, her protective gaze locked on her baby. Jack exhaled. It was time. He had known this moment would come. Had known from the very start that Skye wasn't meant for fences, that the wild still called to her. And now, her foal was strong enough to follow her. She didn't belong here. And Jack wasn't going to stand in her way. A silent understanding. Skye stopped near the open gate, her ears flicking forward. The foal nudged against her, playful now, full of newfound life. Jack stayed where he was, watching quietly. He wasn't going to try and keep her. She had already made her decision. Skye turned her head toward him, her dark eyes locking onto his. And for a long moment, they simply stood there, looking at each other. Jack swallowed hard. There was something in her gaze, a quiet understanding. A thank you, maybe. Jack gave a slow nod. Go on, girl, he murmured. Go home. Skye hesitated for only a second longer, then she turned. The foal followed, his small, strong legs carrying him forward. Jack watched as they stepped through the open gate, the wind kicking up dust around them. Skye didn't run. She walked. And Jack stayed rooted to the spot, watching them grow smaller, watching them return to the wild where they belonged. His chest felt tight. It wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was just a goodbye. Letting go. Jack stood there long after they disappeared, hands in his pockets, staring at the horizon. He had spent years thinking he had nothing left to fight for. nothing left to save. And yet, for a fleeting moment, he had been part of something again. A small, unexpected miracle. Jack sighed, shaking his head. Damn horses, he muttered under his breath. Then, finally, he turned away. The barn was quiet now. The pastures were empty again. But for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel alone. Final lesson. Jack stood at the barn doors, looking out at the open plains. Sky had been a reminder of something he had long forgotten. That love isn't about holding on. Sometimes, love means letting go. And sometimes, even when they leave, they never really leave you. Jack gave one last glance at the horizon, then walked inside, a small, knowing smile on his face. Because somehow, he knew, Sky would always find her way back.